domination of the world economy by the cultures of Islam continued well into the 17th century. The obvious reason for its final unravelling was the European discoveries of routes around the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, and the creation, first of all, of the Portuguese maritime empires, which brought to an end the effective domination of countries like Egypt, which had handled previously the trade between Europe and India, and also other civilizational factors. But for this period of at least 1,000 years, there was Islam sitting astride the world's great trade routes, those routes that are sometimes known to economic historians as the Golden Web. And this Golden Web spread out from the Middle East. One of the trade routes, in many ways the most lucrative, allowed truly gigantic caravan trains, including perhaps 50 or 60,000 people and as many animals, to arrive on a regular basis from the great cities of China via Central Asia, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, to the Abbasid capital of Baghdad at that time, that is in the early Abbasid period, had a population perhaps of as many as 2 million. From Baghdad, the same goods would be transshipped on to various other destinations. One particularly important road linked Baghdad to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, and thence, of course, to Eastern Europe. To the south of Baghdad, there was the also important trade route down to the Yemen being the great source for spices and certain perfumes. There was also to the south of Baghdad the great trading ports of a place called al-Ubulla, which really no longer exists. And somewhat later, this place was eclipsed by the growing importance of the city of Basra, today the second city of Iraq. But they're very close to each other. Al-Ubulla is a few miles to the west of the present city centre of Basra. Of course, we have from that time the great maritime legends of Sinbad the Sailor, which reflect the enormous cultural importance of this trade and of these two cities. And through Al-Ubulla and Basra, great sea routes linked the Islamic Empire to India, particularly the city of Surat in Gujarat in western India, and further afield to the Indies, that is to Sumatra and Java, where thriving Muslim communities soon grew up, which presided over the peaceful Islamization of that part of the world. Another important city was a place called Qulzum. Again, it has largely vanished into the sands. The traditional Muslim name for the Red Sea was Bahr al-Qulzum. Now they call it al-Bahr al-Ahmar, the Red Sea. And Qulzum was very close to the present-day city of Suez at the top of the Red Sea. The Muslims were particularly conscious of the importance of that isthmus. There were serious plans for the digging of what was later to be brought into reality as the Suez Canal. And in following the instructions of the second Caliph Omar, a canal was in fact dug, but not to the north of Qulzum, but rather to the west, connecting the city of Fustat, just to the south of present-day Cairo, with the city of Qulzum, right across the desert. And the canal still exists, you can see it, and there's some ancient engineering works and buildings around it. And this, of course, acted as an enormous stimulus to world trade and cemented the importance of the Middle East in that pattern. Finally, and probably of least significance, there was trade with Europe itself. And Europe was really something of a backwater on this great golden web, largely because Europe didn't have very much that the rest of the world wanted. A few raw materials, a little bit of silver from the Balkans, for instance. Cinnabar came from places in Spain, cinnabar being the mineral from which mercury was traditionally extracted, and also raw materials, particularly fabrics, wool from England, for instance, which found its way into the Middle East where it was in demand. You have to recall that by 800 at the latest, the entire Mediterranean basin, not just its southern fringes, was dominated politically and economically by the Muslim presence. In fact, there's a famous Belgian historian called Henri Pirenne, one of the great historical thinkers of the 20th century, who made his reputation 50 or 60 years ago now by publishing a book called Mohammed and Charlemagne. Pirenne's idea was that Europe's self-awareness as an entity didn't exist under the Romans, because Europe was simply part and parcel of a larger Mediterranean ecumenical space. But once the Arab conquests effectively amputated most of the provinces of the Roman Empire from the rest of Europe, then Europe started to turn in on itself and began to acquire a sense of its own identity. And Pirenne's thesis, as it's known, is actually generally accepted now by historians. So this was one of the great formative influences of the Arab eruption on the history of Europe. I've mentioned that it wasn't just the southern Mediterranean and of course the eastern Mediterranean that was dominated by the Arabs, and of course by this time Spain was very firmly in Muslim hands as well. But there were also very significant Muslim settlements, colonies if you like, along the northern coast of the Mediterranean. In particular, we find, for instance, in southern France, in a town nowadays, small town called La Garde-Freinet, more usually known to historians as Fraxinetum. It's not far from present-day Nice. For the best part of 200 years, there was a thriving Muslim city there, independent of the caliphate, but nonetheless very important. It was in fact the most important port of France in that period. It only fell to the Franks in 973. Corsica and Sardinia were also in Muslim hands. In fact, if you look at the the regional symbol of Corsica, now of course part of France, you'll see that it is a black head with a turban. They call it la tête mort, because so much of Corsica's medieval history is intimately tied up with its relationship with the Muslim world. Also on the Italian coast, you had in particular a number of small Muslim settlements, sometimes barely more than garrisons or fortresses along the coast. Amalfi was the best known of these, and one reason for the fluorescence of Amalfi as the first of the great Italian Christian trading states was the fact that patterns of trade and local trading traditions had already been developed under the period of Muslim rule. Sicily, of course, also becomes substantially a Muslim country until the time of the Norman invasion. And as I say, the only break on this almost colonial expansion of the Muslim world towards the north was the fact that the Arabs generally were not terribly interested in Europe. They had this idea, and indeed to a large extent the experience of Europe, as a rather cold, unfriendly place, full of forests with no major settlements, no significant economic activity. The fact that the great intellectual and spiritual life of Europe, by this time becoming quite considerable, was enclosed within monasteries didn't help. And generally the medieval Arab stereotype was of Europe as a kind of dark continent, something quite barbarous and uninteresting. So the Arabs had a lot that Europeans, particularly in the emergent courts, the Ottonians, the Carolingians, wanted to import. They really wanted Arab spices. They wanted finished manufactured goods, particularly things like crystal goblets, gold, silver products, ivory in particular, fabrics and carpets. And in fact, if you look at European paintings, really until the 17th century, usually you'll be able to spot in the background 2 or 3 things that clearly are not of European manufacture but come from the Islamic world. One way in which we have been able to piece together the history of Oriental carpets is by looking at paintings by people like Holbein, who in their attention to detail would pick out in great detail the patterns on these carpets. So luxury goods generally in medieval Europe were almost exclusively imported from Europe. And as I said, Europe exported a few things in exchange, wool and so forth. Also slaves were a very important export from medieval Europe. The slave trade came to be dominated particularly by the Venetians. The Venetians were the great slave traders in that period. Now, one reason why the Arabs found it so easy to dominate the Mediterranean was their superior knowledge of shipbuilding techniques. It's an interesting fact that not only did the early Muslims suddenly acquire the military prowess that enabled them to conquer the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire of Persia simultaneously, which you would think was some kind of military madness, the equivalent, say, of Upper Volta today simultaneously declaring war on the United States and Russia. In those terms, it was quite comparable. But they did that and they succeeded. They divided their forces, defeated both of these great empires. But something we less frequently recall is the fact that very rapidly the early Arab Muslims became a great maritime nation. In the time of the fifth Caliph Muawiyah, the first significant fleet was constructed by the Arabs in Alexandria, and they showed themselves such good sailors that they promptly thrashed the Byzantine navy and established unchallenged Muslim naval superiority throughout the Mediterranean, with the exception only of the Aegean and parts of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which were still regarded as being within the Byzantine sphere of influence. So they had this extraordinary ability to adapt. But in the longer term, what proved no less influential was their knowledge, as I've said, of shipbuilding techniques. And this, again, was made possible by the fact that the Muslim empire straddled both halves of the formerly divided world. What the Muslims did was to import into the Mediterranean shipbuilding techniques that had long been known amongst the navigators in the far more difficult and treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, the distances were much more considerable. Sometimes ships would go as far as China. And the ships were a lot larger and they were a lot sturdier. So we find these ships immediately being introduced into the Mediterranean with the Muslim port cities of Syria and Egypt particularly. The galley, which had formerly been the main method of long-range seafaring in the Mediterranean, was not completely displaced, but by and large the Muslims didn't use galleys very much, largely because they had something called the Lateen sail. I'm afraid I can't tell you whether this is actually a word of Oriental origin. It might be. But it was much more effective and efficient than the former rather simple square sails, single-masted square-sailed vessels which had been used in the Mediterranean hitherto, the so-called carrack. Now, European shipbuilders in due season started to pick up on these Arab techniques, and they started to improve on them. And in fact, it is accepted that the great journeys of discovery undertaken by the Europeans in the 15th century, whether around the Cape or across to the Americas, were based in large measure on this Indian Ocean technology that had been brought to the Mediterranean by the Arabs. The use of multi-masted vessels, for instance, hitherto unknown, the use of this Lateen sail, and certain technical improvements on how you actually bolt together and caulk a seafaring vessel. So, because of this capacity of the Europeans to emulate these innovations, European navigators started to rejoin the world of trade. So Amalfi becomes a Christian city once more. And if you ever visit Italy, south of Naples, Amalfi is certainly one of the most splendid places to visit. It has a wonderful 11th century cathedral, one of whose most interesting features is its, I think, quite happy combination of Moorish and Christian Gothic idioms. The cloisters there in particular are almost completely Moorish in inspiration, with characteristically Sicilian Arab forms of decoration. But it becomes a Christian city again and continues in its former role as a great maritime city. And its example is followed in the 2 centuries that followed by places like Pisa, Genoa, and of course Venice, all beginning their own illustrious maritime histories in this period. Now, these Europeans had trading partners in North Africa, and by this time many of the leading mercantile families in North Africa were not Muslims, but were actually North African Jews. And the reason why North African Jewry flourished in this period, at least commercially, was that it was easier for Jewish merchants to visit Europe and trade than it was for Muslims, because there was some kind of tradition of tolerating a Jewish presence in most European cities. There were ghettos where they could live and so forth. People had experience of them, whereas it was much more difficult in practice for a Muslim merchant to visit Europe. So we have at this point the emergence of very important Jewish contributions to Mediterranean trade.